Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tracy Forrest. I'm the director of the Waterloo Institute for Sustainable Energy. And with our presenting partner today, the Climate Action Project, I'm very pleased to welcome you here this afternoon. The Waterloo Institute for Sustainable Energy is the focal point for energy studies at the University of Waterloo. Our members include 100 faculty and are joined by hundreds of graduate students at the university. And our vision is clean energy, accessible and affordable for all. So many months ago, I was approached by Mavis Chen and Aisha Stewart of the Climate Action Project in regards to hosting this panel. And it was an idea that they had in their mind to provide a forum of debate on the question of how do we move forward with decarbonizing our energy supply. So I'm very pleased that Mavis and Aisha, that we were able to bring that here today. And I will now ask them to introduce the Climate Action Project and their goals for the event today, and also to introduce our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. So my name is Mavis Chen, and this is Aisha Stewart. We're both undergraduate students at the University of Waterloo, and we're part of Climate Action Project, which is under the Waterloo Public Interest Research Group. To tell you a little more about Climate Action Project, the club's mission is to encourage more student involvement in climate initiatives and to ultimately push for stronger climate legislation. Because of the impact of the energy sector on global climate change and on the economy, we wanted to provide students with an opportunity to learn more about the issues related to this industry. And that's why we had approached WISE and decided to work with Tracy and Iris and the WISE team to put together our event today, a panel on the future of energy decarbonization in Canada. We are very fortunate today to be joined by our very distinguished group of panelists who will be addressing the issues related to this topic. But first, I would like to introduce our wonderful moderator, Dr. Paul Parker, who is a professor at the University of Waterloo under the Department of Geography and Environmental Management. Paul is also the director of the Economic Development Program, and his research focuses on creating sustainable communities by finding win-win opportunities for both the environment and the economy. He first looks at energy conservation and then improving energy efficiency, and then looking at renewable energy sources and implementing smart grid systems into community energy plans. And so without further ado, please welcome our moderator, Paul Parker, and our panelists.
Thank you, Mavis and Aisha. I confess I always love student-organized events, and especially when you start with looking ahead, because the question is, what future do you want? And when the answer comes back, decarbonization, the smile starts to grow, I feel good, and then it's great to say, who do you partner with to see how do we make that vision a reality? Go to WISE. What a perfect starting point. So the combination of WPIRG, WISE, let's bring in some interesting and excellent panelists, and so it gives me a great pleasure to introduce today. First, Barbara Rueber is the Vice President Environment at Ontario Power Generation. Jason Thistlewait is the Director of the Climate Adaptation Project here at the University of Waterloo. And Scott Thurlow is the President of the Canadian Renewable Fuels Association. Being a very student and democratic organization, the organizers suggested that I let each panelist give a brief bio about themselves and their interest in this decarbonization theme. So perhaps, Barbara, we could invite you to start.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the Waterloo Public Interest Research Group and the Climate Action Program for inviting me here today. Thank Mavis and Aisha. There they are. They've done a great job organizing, and say I'm really pleased to be here today. As Paul said, I'm Vice President Environment at Ontario Power Generation. First, I'll tell you what our company is. Ontario Power Generation is an electricity generating company based here in Ontario. We operate 2 nuclear power stations, 5 thermal power stations, and 65 hydroelectric power stations on 24 river systems across the province, as well as 2 wind turbines. and we provide about 60% of the electricity supply to the province of Ontario. So as the environment lead for the company, I oversee the policies and programs we have in place to ensure we comply with environmental legislation, to minimize our effects on the environment, to achieve the environmental performance objectives we set for ourselves. But also, and importantly to this forum, we're the group that's supposed to provide environmental leadership to the company. And so in that way, we look forward and try and assist in setting directions with a strategy group on where the company might want to go in the future from an environmental perspective. I think I'll leave it on that. My background, I did an undergraduate degree in engineering many moons ago, and after that I did a master's in botany, strangely enough, in an environmental studies program both at University of Toronto.
Hi, my name is Thistlewait. I'd again like to thank the organizers, CAP and WISE, for being here today. I'm really grateful for the opportunity. It's meetings like this that I think we need to have a lot more of, because I do think that awareness and action and actually people speaking their minds on this issue is really important. So again, thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to be here. So a bit on my background. I was first interested in this issue of decarbonization in 2008 when we had a big financial crisis, biggest one since the Depression. And during the crisis, one of the major causes was that we had mispriced a lot of risk related to the housing market, and we assumed it was worth a lot more than it was. Well, I immediately had the same concern about fossil fuels and the fact that if we, as the climate changes, a lot of the assets that we traditionally rely on and value as part of our economy may not be worth as much. So I was immediately interested in this concept of climate change risk. That led me to do a PhD on the topic here, specifically on the financial risks of climate change. Since then, I started working with some insurance companies. They were the biggest interests in this space in Canada, but also internationally. For obvious reasons, they're losing their shirt because of all the extreme weather, but they're also massive investors. And with that, I ended up working to develop an initiative here called the Climate Change Adaptation Project. It's a partnership between Intact Financial Corporation and the University of Waterloo. And we're looking at trying to develop cost-effective strategies to help our economy adapt to these impacts of climate change. Since then, I've been fortunate enough to be appointed as a faculty member in the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development, and I'll be starting there in July. So if you're in environment and business in any one of those programs, I'm excited to see more of you.
My name is Scott Thurlow. I'm the president of the Canadian Renewable Fuels Association. Our association represents the interests of the producers of ethanol and renewable diesel. Ethanol and renewable diesel are not necessarily substitutes, but complements to the traditional petroleum streams that you see in the transportation sector. Our association is heavily focused here in the province of Ontario based on the proximity to corn. The simple reality is that our association, we produce fuels from a sustainable biomass feedstock, and we are looking at aggressive ways to monetize the carbon benefits that our fuels create.
Excellent. Well, with all of this expertise up front, I bet there are hundreds of questions in the audience. So how do we go from hundreds of questions to a short list? Thank you for our coordinators have brought many questions and distilled them to a small number of questions. So I will pose these questions for our panelists, asking them to answer them briefly, 2 to 3 minutes each. So that way we get through sort of the set of questions, and then we can open it up for a freer discussion after that. So if we want to start off the first question, and this comes back to Mavis's point about legislation, what is the impact of climate change legislation on your industry? And or what is the role of government subsidies in your industry? Scott, did you want to start?
At me, so I'll take that on. So first of all, we don't like the word subsidy. We see it as business support. And as you may or may not know, the province of Ontario invested $1.5 billion into our industry in 2007. The economic return on that was 4 to 1. That's taxes, that's revenue, that's jobs, that's support for our farmers, it's rural economic development, and it actually is paying for itself. At a federal level, you saw approximately $1.5 billion that went to the build-out of the entire industry. And sorry, I misspoke on Ontario. It's $525 million. It's $1.5 billion for the federal government, and we've seen a 3-to-1 return on investment there. Climate change legislation and regulation is probably the most poorly reported news story in the country. And I am by far not the person who is going to be saying that we don't need more of it. We absolutely need more of it, but understand, we actually have very stringent carbon relation rules in most of the Canadian provinces right now, and there are regulations promulgated under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act that specifically apply to carbon reduction and or abatement entirely. One of them is the fact that CO2 is a toxic substance. Now, I understand that there's a little bit of a contradiction there in that CO2 is also something that's a necessity for life. But under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, under Section 64, that power to designate something as toxic has been given to the Minister of Health and the Minister of Environment, and they are aggressively regulating in this space. But you can't regulate in a vacuum, and it is incredibly important that we create regulations that will allow for Canadian businesses to thrive and won't see those same carbon molecules just created somewhere else. Ohio's not that far away, and we don't want to cripple the Ontario economy when the net result will be the same.
Thank you. Perhaps we just go down the line. Jason, do you?
Sure. So on the subsidy side, I actually have a quick question for you. So how much subsidies does the federal government give to fossil fuel industry in Canada?
You know what? It's a point that I kind of make behind closed doors all the time.
You're amongst friends here.
And being taped. The mineral exploration tax credit was created in the 1970s, and I have charitably described the subsidy, the business support that our industry has gotten as a rounding error in comparison, and we'll leave it at that.
Okay, so that gives you some perspective on, so it's on the financial, and I'll speak on primarily on behalf of the investors in the financial industry. Investors are value chasers. When you have massive subsidies going to parts of the economy that we see as leading to liabilities in our futures, things like fossil fuel emissions, it leads to perverse outcomes, where investors are going to see this as a much more profitable place to put their money as opposed to something like biofuels. So from that perspective, subsidies in Canada are having a bit of a perverse incentive on the way that investors behave. On the climate change legislation side, it's similar. There needs to be a clear cut cost put on carbon, and I think Scott's right on this one. The first place it needs to happen is probably Washington. In Canada, we've decided to be regulatory takers instead of regulatory makers in this space. And so from the financial industry, having that surefire cost will factor into where you start allocating capital in the most efficient way as possible. There's an absolute desire within the financial industry for climate change legislation.
And the oil and gas sector, I'd like to point out, by the way.
In particular, if they had it their way, they would love a North American cap and trade system. Banks and financial institutions make money off of charging you small fees on you transacting, making a financial transaction, and all that would create is another economy for them. They've been some of the largest funders of some of the U.S. Groups pushing for a cap and trade system in the United States, and behind closed doors here, they're nation supporters of it as well. So there is some support there.
Great. Barbara.
Little change in tact in my industry, electricity production. Legislation's had a huge impact in Ontario. You may or may not be familiar with the fact that we used to generate about a third of our electricity from burning coal, and now it's illegal to burn coal in Ontario to generate electricity after this year. Dropped carbon emissions in carbon dioxide emissions by 30 teragrams, a huge amount, significant contributor to Ontario achieving its CO2 reduction goals, and Canada, in fact, on the Canadian scale. So legislation and a strong policy commitment has had an impact here in Ontario. However, I'm going to get to the however part, there is federal legislation. There's federal legislation meaning that coal plants can't continue to generate at past levels. They'll have to phase out over time. But the challenge I see is what you do with natural gas legislation. So the federal government is moving to legislate natural gas. The problem is that if all the growth that comes in the electricity sector goes to natural gas, even if it's efficient natural gas, all the benefits we gain from going off coal will just go away. And this speaks to the carbon cost and the cap and trade. You can't allow unlimited growth of efficient technology, even of efficient technology, if it's still emitting carbon. And that's the challenge I see. We've done something bold in Ontario, moving off coal, but we have to make sure we retain that benefit with a legislative framework that doesn't allow unlimited growth in gas generation.
So I just want to compliment one thing that you said, that in our society, when we produce energy, we are going to be releasing carbon molecules, period, okay? It's just a matter of which type of carbon molecules and where they're being released. Biogenic carbon, so carbon that comes from renewable, sustainable biomass that's above the crust, that is still carbon, but it doesn't contribute to the greenhouse effect because it's already part of the biogenic atmosphere that we live in. It's sequestered carbon, carbon that would otherwise have to be unearthed, and when that is emitted into the atmosphere, which is a problem. We also have very aggressive provincial programs on carbon absorption and carbon sequestration. Those are other areas where we can kind of get at the same end goal instead of just randomly putting a cap and saying thou shalt emit X amount of carbon dioxide, which I do not think is a solution.
If I might just add, there are actually very low carbon energy streams as well. So not every energy choice is a high carbon option.
No, I just said
But that's
sub-carbon.
yeah, okay, very good. Very good. Some is much better. Barbara, you were giving us a perfect answer, I thought, for leading into the student's next question. That was, if you could change something in your industry towards sustainability or decarbonization, what would it be? You've given us part of the answer. Don't grow fossil, the natural gas sector too large. Do you have other ideas, or expand on that one?
Well, I think, and I heard it, I think a cap and trade program or a carbon tax, or putting a price on carbon is really the short answer to getting a solution. Obviously, 2 points, I guess. There's not really that political driver out there in Canada at this time. I think we've heard it. You're not going to see a price on carbon. So, but there are other things you can do. People may call them subsidies. I call them other financial instruments. You can find means to support non-carbon emitting sources of generation. So if we're looking forward and we prepare a business case to put forward a energy generation project, the business case is based on dollars, and if there's no carbon cost, then a carbon project may just win out. If there's an incentive in the form of a tax break, sometimes you can get loan guarantees. There's a number of mechanisms that the government has that it can apply. You can kind of advance the business case for the non-carbon emitting thing. So if there's no political will at this time for a carbon tax or cap and trade, then let's look at the other instruments and let's apply them to non-emitting sources.
So I actually don't agree with you. I think that there are active carbon markets in North America and in Canada. Quebec has an active carbon market. It's new, it's 4 months old. The price of carbon's probably a little bit low as to what some people want, but it's a market. The Federal Renewable Fuels Regulation has a carbon market included in it for people who over-comply. So we have a 5% mandate for gasoline, we have a 2% mandate for diesel, and what that means is that if somebody blends above that, they have created compliance credits, which they can then distribute and sell to other people. How ironic that the government of Canada says we're not going to create a job-killing carbon tax and created 2 carbon taxes. But that's neither here nor there. It's semantics. The question is, how would you increase the regulation in your industry? Believe it or not, we're actually blending at closer to 10% ethanol in Canada right now. And the reason for that is because ethanol is cheaper than gasoline, and that's net government support. okay? And also, it is incredibly high in octane. So when you go to the pump, and I always gravitate to the left and get the cheapest gas, okay? But there are 3 different levels that's normally offered at the various pumps. And the higher the octane level, the more likely it is that it is a higher ethanol content. I would push both of those mandates up. We could easily function on 5% renewable content in diesel, and we could see ethanol blends upwards of 20–30% based on the technology that will be coming onto Ontario roads in the next little while. We have over 100,000 flex fuel vehicles that have been sold in this province. We have 3 E85 pumps. It's a long lineup.
You might remind them what you mean by E85.
85% ethanol, 15% gasoline.
Perfect, thanks. Jason?
So, I think from an investor's perspective, so there's 2 ways to answer this question, right? I mean, regulation's going to help. You know, you will start to see some money shift out of some of the really, really dirty fossil fuels. But the financial industry is really interesting because culturally, it has a bit of a bias towards the idea of investing in things that are green or on the environmental side. And for the most part, is that the returns are long term. And for an investor, they're getting a check at the end of the year, and that check will reflect how much money they have made their shareholders. So when I go and I ask an investor, I said, well, aren't you worried about, you know, all this money flowing into parts of the economy that in the end is going to cost us more than we're going to earn off of it? And they say, well, my shareholders don't want that. So it then shifts a part of this debate away from the industry itself into the people who are actually in charge of it, and that's us. I mean, we're shareholders. We're the ones that, when you get a job, you contribute to a pension, or if you have a little extra money around, you'll put it into an RRSP. And so there's a gap there. So we have shareholders on the one end, and we have what investors are doing on the other with our money, and we have where the money is going. And that speaks to me anyway, to a gap in transparency. So one of the things that we've seen internationally happen is a real significant push to strengthen financial reporting standards around fossil fuels, around climate change risks, around greenhouse gas emissions, so that they know when we're talking about these, an investor knows when they're talking about these carbon markets, they can just go to their little computer, because they're making decisions, you know, a mile a minute, and just see, you know, what potential exposure this industry could have to A, regulation, B, changes in consumer behavior, you know, starting to buy E85 stuff. They don't know this because they're working within that year. So anything that helps sort of transition the culture within that sector from such a short-term bias to anything a little longer, which is, you know.
Well, it's good to see new products coming in, like your climate change investment funds or your green investing. Yeah. So there are a few modifications coming. But I guess I have a confession now. I'd like to introduce the elephant in the room. We do not have a spokesperson for the oil and gas or the non-renewable source sector here. But the next question, of course, the students want to engage them in the debate, so they're going to give you the opportunity to please speak to our, you know, what would you like to say in terms of this? I've got to choose between fuels. Do I go for the non-renewable or the renewable? Renewable, that sounds like your field, Scott.
So I've got a secret to tell everyone in the room. On my board of 8 members on our board, we have 3 oil and gas companies. So to say in a monolithic way that oil and gas is opposed to decarbonization is a fiction. Suncor owns the largest ethanol plant in the country. Husky owns 2 ethanol plants, one in Manitoba, one in Saskatchewan. Valero owns the world's largest renewable diesel plant. Neste Oil owns 5 renewable diesel plants. They are investing in this technology, and thank God, because they're the ones who have the money. They are the ones that are trying to make the best product, the most disruptive product, because that will give them a market edge against all the other companies. Now, I'm not going to pretend that it's sunshine and lollipops and rainbows and puppy dogs. There are oil and gas companies who really dislike renewable content because they sell oil, okay? I'm not going to pretend that they don't. But there are a lot of what I will describe as progressive oil and gas companies who are sinking hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars into this investment space because of the things that you just identified, because they know that they're going to have GHG reduction requirements and they need to find new ways to do that. Because the oil that they are seeking out is actually going to be creating greater GHGs. The deeper the sequestration, the more energy intensive it is to extract that product, the more they're going to have to reduce in the long run.
Barbara, would you like to engage this fossil fuel representative here?
That guy? Yeah, a couple of things. I wanted to, first of all, respond to Scott's kind of view that I was incorrect about carbon pricing. May be true in your industry, not at all true in my industry. I think that's one of the challenges we're seeing, and I think that speaks to oil and gas too, which is where I want to go. Oil and gas has upstream emissions, and really in the upstream emission side, that's where I think there's a lot of work to be done. So this is the resource recovery work in Alberta, and again, that's where, you know, there are challenges. I think it may have to do with the pace of change and the willingness that people's willingness to take on the economic burden of the pace of that change. So there will be a cost. And there's no time like when you're investing in something new. So my view is that, you know, you may have some existing production of carbon dioxide emissions, and you look for the end of life of those assets, and that's the time when you really require people to put in place the newest, cleanest, and best technology and set up the incentives for it.
Well, and that new investment is critical in a growing economy like the Canadian. Jason?
I'm empathetic with the oil and gas industry, but with a couple caveats. They do get a bad rap to the extent that, you know, ultimately it's us that's driving the cars around, right? And you know, I was fortunate to be in a meeting with U.S. Secretary of Energy before he switched and you know, the question comes up: why aren't the Americans then, if you have this robust democratic environmental movement pushing Obama to stop Keystone and so on from happening, why aren't you doing anything about greenhouse gas emissions? Well, there's 185 U.S. cities that are dependent on coal fuel for power and electricity. So relative to what we're doing up here, we end up getting a little, you know, we're a little bit better off. Now, the two caveats that I'd mentioned is the fossil fuel industry in Canada, or our oil representative here, really has to watch the back on two fronts. So how many of you plan on living, just try and be honest as possible, how many of you plan on living in the suburbs when you actually can afford to live a house? Buy a house. Okay. Yeah, not many of you, unless the rest of you are afraid to raise your hand and so on. That's a troubling signal for the fossil fuel industry in Canada, because if you do plan on living more in an urban area along a core transportation route, as what we're seeing in terms of some of the information coming out of young consumers, you're not going to be buying as much oil as you once were, nor will you be necessarily buying a car. So there's an emerging consumer pressure. The second type of pressure they need to watch out for are, of course, what the investors are up to. If governments do actually commit through regulation to limit greenhouse gas emissions below 2 degrees centigrade, all of the bigs in Canada face massive credit risk. They're highly capitalized on the upfront because it costs so much money to get the oil out of the ground. That means they need a lot of investment to get there. If these regulations come into place, you're going to see what's happening in Norway right now happen in other parts of the world. And this is where the Norwegian pension fund is actively debating divesting from fossil fuels. That's a big player. Other investors will listen. And so that would be my 2 cents.
So I would just add one little caveat to that. And the other jurisdiction that is leading in climate change legislation and regulation is, wait for it, Alberta. And Alberta actually has a very significant carbon tax, which they have called something else. They've called it their tech fund. And so you invest into this tech fund based on what your carbon emissions are and what your allowances are. And then in the future, you can draw from that to reinvest into your facility, to build new facilities, to extract petroleum resources in a more sustainable or a less environmentally damaging way. It's full right now, that fund. So I would take a little bit of issue at the fact that there aren't programs that are in place that will allow for future exploration to happen based on today's investments. But the other issue, and the other elephant in the room, is the fact that we're going to have 9 billion people on our planet. They're all going to live carbon-intense lives in some way, shape, or form. We can talk about why Washington's important. Beijing, Mumbai, Indonesia, Brazil, these are the places where we really have to worry about the global GHG problem.
Well, it's good. We've got a much more broadening. I don't know if there's room for 9 billion of us in this room. And I guess I would start by saying, Barbara, I think we're lucky we've got students that are interested in energy issues. But that raises the next question of how do you engage the general audience that isn't in this room, that isn't as educated? So how do you bring them to understand what, in your case, OPG is doing in terms of how do we move towards a less carbon-intensive future?
I think the way you don't do it is to say we'd like to engage you in an energy policy discussion, because that's not,
I saw the person that came to that meeting.
Yeah, that's right.
Sorry, Jeopardy's on.
But we have, for our company, and I can't speak generally, there's a couple of things we do. We try and connect with people in their areas of interest. And that's twofold for us. There are lots of connections through nature, and a lot of the programs we do are in the natural sciences area with respect to supporting biodiversity and kind of other water quality enhancement initiatives. So often through that route, through connections with the kind of natural sciences areas, you can engage with people, open the discussions, and then that leads into a broader discussion about what your company is, what it's doing, and that then takes you into the form of energy. The other is a kind of community-based approach. So where we have generating stations that are often a very strong presence in a community. People are interested, there are jobs there, that we've got a physical presence there, and they're also concerned about what our emissions or activities may do to their living environment. So we also will take a community-based approach. So we don't pitch it big, we pitch it at the level that we believe we can connect with them and there's an interest, and then that will often move through into a broader discussion.
What a radical idea, going where the people are, rather than saying, I've got the room if you can come and see me. Jason.
Well, in terms of engagement, I think we need to give people a sense of control. It's one thing that they feel is missing on these issues about climate change and energy. What can I do, right? Well, you can actually do a lot. Paul's research focuses heavily on what you can do in your home. Your home is one of the least, efficient places from an energy perspective that you have, and there's a lot you can do there to improve your energy efficiency. So I think it's giving people a bit of a sense of control over just the tools that they have in front of them. And believe it or not, there's a business case. You actually save money by conserving. More information and more outreach on that front, I think, are effective. But it still comes down to, overcoming some of the obstacles that I still tangle with, and that is that people really struggle. They are, and I'm empathetic to this, people work 9 to 5, you've got lives, you've got a busy schedule. How can you all
9 to 5, where do I get that job?
Sure. 7 to 10, whatever it may be, you have a busy day, and I think there's some interesting communication strategies that are emerging, specifically on the climate side, to doing that. Things like connecting the weather that happens in your community to your actions, or connecting changes in your environment to your actions. Recognizing that the reason why your basement flooded wasn't necessarily the municipality's fault, is because you didn't take the time to read an insurance contract or read what's on the front page of your municipality's website to tell you what to do, or try and reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. So to me, it's about giving people a sense of control in any way possible.
There's no one left out there that doesn't understand your industry, or is there? Do you have to reach out to people?
So I stopped trying a long time ago. In incredibly technical matters, regulation and legislation is the way that you will achieve these goals. You will achieve these goals by building popular support against the problem, which is in this case climate change, and then you will propose solutions to various levels of government to achieve those goals. Yesterday, I was at a session in Toronto that actually had a protest at it because of my industry. Like, I'm the good guy, right? I'm not big oil and gas. I'm the one who's supposed to be there trying to extend the life of our planet. Nope. You're always going to get people who, as I like to say, are interested in arguing with a rhinoceros, and data doesn't matter to them. Policymakers care about data, and political decision makers think about winning votes. And so if you can provide them a way of increasing the amount of capital in your wallet and simultaneously sustaining economic growth in the policy sphere, you're going to be very successful. And this is why I'm very interested in the research that you guys are doing, which is how the environment and the economy are not somehow mutually exclusive. And there is this nefarious undertone to saying, GHG regulation equals less jobs. And I myself fell victim to it at the very beginning of my presentation when I talked about Ohio. But there are ways that you can have regulation that will spur economic growth.
Well, you're actually leading in, students are always ahead of us, and so you're actually almost guessing what their next question is. So they're saying, well, if there are gaps on the pros and cons of your particular industry, how do you fill them? How do you better educate? How do you share that information? Or are there pros and cons that should be better understood?
I come to events like this one, and no, it's incredibly important for our industry to be out there and to be talking about this as much as they can. We can't all afford advertising. Advertising is obviously the easiest way to do it. With all due respect to our friends in the oil sands and the 75 employees that they have that work at CAP and their $65 million advertising budget, yeah, they're pretty effective at getting their message out. I got Corncob Bob, Google that, and The Daily Show, and you'll be able to see our exposure. We are out in the public as much as we can, and that's all you can do. You have to focus your resources on earned media and providing a compelling case as to why the things that you're doing are in the best interests of both society and the economy.
Jason, are there these gaps in information?
Right, so what I'd like to see is, the story goes a little bit further back, but during the 1990s, Greenpeace thought, oh, we finally got, the countervailing industrial pressure to the oil and gas industry, where the oil and gas industry is going to be fighting this issue of climate change. Well, the insurance industry, they're going to become these big advocates for change. They'll push mitigation, they'll push adaptation, and so on. That hasn't become a reality. The insurance industry is still very quiet about this, and could be doing a lot more. They're more forthright in places like Europe, but definitely in North America, they could be doing more to explain to people just how their, for instance, property insurance premiums work. What you're covered for, what you're not covered for, how your actions influence those types of premiums. They could also be doing a good job talking to each side of their business. So the insurance industry is divided in half. You have people who underwrite insurance policies on the one side. You then pay your insurance premium, it goes into that one side, and then you have investors on the other side that go and make sure that there's money around in case your house burns down and that money is accessible. Well, the people on the underwriting side are freaking out that most places along coastlines and anywhere near rivers are going to be uninsurable in 25 years. But they're not telling that to the other side of the business that's continually investing in things like fossil fuels and high returns that are actually causing the problem. So to me, there's some...
Well, it's very slow movement, because my confession is I did my PhD in London, and at that time the insurance industry already knew. They knew they should be selling carbon, buying hydrogen, but 25 years later, you're still singing the same song. Yeah. Barbara, information gaps?
Yes, I mean, there's two sectors out there. There's the kind of general public that's really not engaged in these discussions. And for them, I think that the media, the political process is where they're going to get their information. It's not. Then I just want to speak a bit about the informed public. So then there's the people that do care, that, yeah, that's you, absolutely, and people that want to be engaged. And I think for those people, there are more for now than there have been before. Obviously, everything's electronic, so you can sign up for, automatic notifications. If they're going to put a regulation out there, you can look at it. You can make a comment. And I think people, it's difficult, it's challenging if you're a student group, but you can do that. One place I've seen effective involvement of people is at public hearing processes. So again, you got to be brave, but you can, as somebody informed, you can inform yourself by participating in some of the public processes that are available and making your voice heard. And I think you especially would be surprised. I've been surprised at we're regulated by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission for our nuclear plants. They hold public hearings. Student groups come in. Do they ever listen to those? So, informed public has some avenues that I don't think are often used because they're left to the kind of experts, but I think input through those means can be meaningful.
I think that's excellent, and guess what? One of your powerful tools is right here in this room. You can use Climate Action WPIRG as an organization to structure your response or your participation in a hearing or a regulation, etc. So you have the tools. Now for one of the questions that again, Barbara, I'll ask you to lead on, because it's one of the big questions. So what's the position with nuclear in our future? You know, we have nuclear in our present, but looking forward, what do you see for the nuclear future?
Yeah. It depends on jurisdiction, obviously, so I'm going to speak of the case here in Ontario and in Canada, and I think we have to start from the fact that nuclear is a very significant part of our generation mix in Ontario. And so we have built the economy and our electricity supply on nuclear, and I think it should continue and to be a significant component going forward to achieve the carbon gains that we want to gain. So it has some carbon emissions. There's some sort of standby generation you need to support the system, but effectively it does not have carbon dioxide emissions. It's a technology that many people don't embrace, and I think to address that, what we have to do is make sure we move forward with the technology. So we have generators that were built a long time ago, and they're a very large centralized system. There's a new generation of reactor, and we have to work with those reactors to make them more acceptable to the public, so they are smaller scale. We have to deal with the waste issue. I mean, that's an issue that hangs out there and is one of the leading reasons that people don't support nuclear power generation. But I think we shouldn't throw out the technology because there are issues with it. It can be a huge contributor to carbon reduction from the energy sector, and we need to work on improving what the industry can do.
Thank you. Jason, your stance on the nuclear sector?
So the environmental community, from my perspective, has been shooting itself in the foot on this one, mainly because it's divided on what to do about nuclear. Now, I'm really concerned that I won't be able to go outside, or I'm going to have to live permanently in an air-conditioned space by the time I retire because of the changes in the climate. I'd like to avoid that. For that reason, I think we absolutely have to expand nuclear. I think a lot of the industry has to do a much better job being forthright about the risks involved, which I think are wildly over-exaggerated, in my personal opinion, and deal with some of the legitimate, I mean, the main reason why you don't have nuclear, one of the big causes is NIMBYism. You know, people really are concerned that you're going to be taking waste out of it and putting it somewhere. And that's a legitimate concern, and it has to be dealt with in a certain way that we haven't been effective with as yet. So, you know, my take is, if we're going to deal with something like climate change, and that's going to be what you feel is an existential threat, and as young people in the room, I think it is, you know, you have to strongly think about ways that we can expand nuclear energy, because there's no other way we're going to get our greenhouse gas emissions down without it.
So far be it for me to agree with everybody else on the panel, but I'll take it one step further. I defy you to find me an energy source that I can't find an environmental problem with, and that includes wind and solar. Okay, photovoltaic cells are so loaded with heavy metals and other dangerous chemicals that, and I mean, everything is a chemical. CO2 is a chemical, H2O is a chemical, but the disposal of the storage cells for that type of energy is very damaging. The amount of energy that goes into creating the steel and the concrete that goes into the windmills probably displaces some of the benefit that accrues from their use. The problem that nuclear has is the Godzilla scenario, the worst case scenario, where your imaginations can very easily be captive to these disasters. I would tell you that climate change is going to be a bigger disaster than all of those potential horrific things combined. And we've been running nuclear at very high levels without any incidents whatsoever in Ontario. So I'm not going to convince you. If you're opposed to nuclear, you know, continue to do your research, but do your research and understand what the mix of energy is in our society. And absolutely, from a carbon abatement strategy, that is the way to go.
Thank you. I confess I have to offer a choice at this point. Scott, I love your bold answer saying these all have problems. I agree perfectly. That's why I'm glad to hear you both saying no sources are carbon free. But I'm happy to have the first choice of which power source I want to dismantle after 40 years, the solar panels versus the nuclear power plant. These are not exactly equals that we are talking about here, and we have very different...
You know what? I'll take the bait.
Okay, good.
On sheer number of electrons of power created versus the impact on the environment, how many photovoltaic cells do you think you have to create to match an ACR reactor? You have to create a lot. So you're right.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there are different issues because radioactivity and the safe storage of fissionable material is absolutely a different type of issue. But again, it's you have to pick your, pardon the pun, poison.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to have some fun because there hasn't been enough debate up here. So how did we suddenly have, and this is on carbon footprinting now, or sort of what is, I changed the agenda a little bit, stance on nuclear. And I confess, I'm not an absolutist. I'm not against nuclear. However, I want us to be aware of the challenges that just the major events like Chernobyl, in terms of the environmental areas that were damaged and therefore no longer used, put nuclear back on the same foothold as fossil fuels in terms of ecological footprint that's being displaced. So there's lots of challenges, and I've been to the Japanese beach where there officially is no radiation, but your local municipal officer is the one that is saying things are glowing. So there's a lot of issues to be dealt with.
Have you been to Lac Megantic? I mean, that's an environmental disaster that was created as a result of negligence. Let's be really clear, there was negligence involved. I'm not so sure I would trust 1986 Soviet nuclear officials on their safety record. I'm just going to put that out there.
Well,
and I think
you can have triple safety systems fail.
In North America, I think our perspective is very different. I'm not going to convince anyone today. I want you to go and do your own research and come up with a conclusion that you're comfortable with. There are alternatives, but which are going to be the most sustainable in the long run?
We're running out of time. Is the point.
Well, time is important on lots of sides, but I'm actually want to thank our panel for getting through the essential questions. I have additional optional questions, but I'd like to break the rules and invite the audience to raise questions so that I know this is sort of a collective student list, but do we have a student that really wants to get their question asked? Yeah, here in the front row.
Especially because the OPG is here, I was really surprised to not hear any mention of efficiency or conservation at all in this panel. And when we're talking about growing nuclear, why don't we consider bringing efficiency and conservation, which I believe is an Ontario government priority right now, so that nuclear can be scaled back. I think we could just maintain nuclear. I don't see why it has to be grown when it's being substituted in a transition with renewable tech. I think renewable can be scaled up if we continue the FIT program, seeing some countries in Europe are able to kind of, traverse that fine line of, supply versus demand. So I'm curious why that wasn't mentioned and what are your thoughts on conservation and efficiency?
I have
was
to
the
say,
next question.
let me jump in and say how I love students. When they look ahead to say, what is the solution to avoiding the 4 degree scenario? We're no longer talking about 2 degrees. The 4 degree scenario, 70% of the carbon savings that can be achieved most economically are by making our buildings more efficient, to actually reduce that energy consumption. And first, you're exactly right to say, perhaps we don't need to build quite so much. But I'm happy to let our panelists come in.
Conservation is no longer our company's mandate. That's largely why I don't speak to it. But in the world of getting the price right, and carbon pricing, I think that's where the conservation driver can come, right? Like if you're not paying for the carbon that goes into the energy you consume, you're going to consume more of it than if you had to pay the price for it. So I totally support conservation, and it's just getting the economics right to get the drivers there, is my perspective.
I'm a champion, as I mentioned, the more you can do at your level to conserve energy, the better. One of the biggest problems, though, I have in saying that is that people really like energy. And it's not just North Americans who really like energy, it's the 3 other billion people that are going to come onto the earth. So when I speak about something like nuclear, I'm not speaking about necessarily a Southern Ontario context. It's how do we get China away from burning coal, which to me is a much more significant threat. So it's more of a balanced take. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that the climate movement has in it is this assumption that, yeah, you know, everyone is like us and we think we don't like using energy, but we do like using energy, no matter what you say. So it's a balance, but the only way you're going to be able to actually begin to teach people about their connection between the environment and energy use is actually by, you know, this is how you can reduce it. It wouldn't help if, it would probably also help too if, you know, politicians in Ontario were to increase the price of electricity. I mean, you'd see conservation go up then.
You get a carbon tax every month. You don't know it. If you use less power, you save more money. 10 years ago, our vehicles were half as efficient as they are today. By 2025, they'll be twice as efficient as they are today. You're absolutely correct, and again, like I thought you were going to lob us that question. That's why we didn't get it. We're also looking at how we can use energy more effectively. Our industry, I mean, our crop yields on Ontario's farms are double what they were 7 years ago. Like, that is impressive. When you think about what you can do with all of that, pardon the pun, solar power. That's what it is. It is the organic creation of solar power. And there are lots of ways that we can do that. And again, my bias is higher ethanol mix will displace sequestered carbon, period.
Excellent. Other questions from the audience? Yes, in blue.
I know that you spoke about E85, but how do you plan on dealing with legacy vehicles that can't support that? Because you have the 100,000 flex fuel, but what about everything else?
So the fleet in Ontario turns over naturally every 7 years, okay? And, you know, Uncle Jake's car from 1977 is always going to be the problem, okay? It's going to be that person who doesn't have the most advanced technology. There will always be accommodations for that technology. You will always be able to find a way to provide fuels for that. My response is to turn that question around and say, do you want to deprive everybody else of the ability to make these environmental choices because of the extreme example on the outside? Or do you want consumers to be able to go to a pump and say, I want to use more ethanol, and I can, and I use my purchasing dollar to buy a better vehicle because I know it will have a higher ethanol content?
Another question in the back.
Sticking on the transportation issue, when is it best to say, yeah, we're going to have E85 ethanol pumps when, you know, maybe it's worth investing in the infrastructure for electric charging stations for vehicles? When does that decision need to be made?
So my position on that one is I just want choices, period. Whether it's electrification, whether it's natural gas, whether it's chocolate chip cookie dough, I don't care. I want options for consumers so that they themselves can use their purchasing power to make those low carbon choices. At lunch, I drew a parallel between two industries. There is an industry that controls street corners and competes very, very strongly for those street corners and will do everything in their power to retain their market share. That's the answer to the question.
Just because the electric vehicle side, Barbara, do you want to mention anything from OPG side?
Yeah, we do see a building future for electric vehicles, but there is a lot of investment in infrastructure required. So we think that you get, for your infrastructure dollar, on the electricity side, you get a lot of benefit because we have a lot of capability to produce electricity that's not used in the off-peak hours. It's sitting idle. You've invested that capital, and it could be used to charge vehicles. So it's very efficient from that capital investment point of view. But I'm no expert, but there are barriers to introduction, and we have to work away at those to build the infrastructure in Ontario.
Another good question. Another question from the audience? Yes.
I had a question about that. It's always about the nuclear debate. You hear about waste all the time. In your perspective, what have you heard about fast neutron reactors? Because I heard that's the future technology in terms of moving towards that, because it produces only hydrogen, I guess, is the waste. You can use a lot of the waste for the energy. That is, it answers to the sort of waste objection that is always a problem.
From my perspective, it's not something that we would look to invest money in now. So research, forward-looking technologies, very important to continue to build them, but it's not here for us yet. I'm no expert on it, but I've never seen it in any of the scenario planning that we're doing. Do any of you guys know about fast neutron reactors?
I'm opposed to it, it sounds scary.
No, but that is not to say, like I say, that obviously that's what you need to do, is to leapfrog into the next generation of nuclear reactor that can solve the presence of the first one, because you can't just keep defending what you've got and dealing with those problems. You need to move forward.
I mean, seriously, AECL has designed a reactor that would fit in this room, the ACR7, which is significantly more efficient, as the technology grows. We've never sold one. ACR7s have existed since 2000 and at least 4, if not earlier than that, and no one has ever purchased one. So, I mean, I want more people to do research into this area to make what's already great even greater and greater and greater, but somebody's got to buy it.
Another question, yes?
From an economic and environmental standpoint, what does the future development of the oil sands mean for Canada and the world?
Economic and environmental, who wants to go first?
So you look at the balance sheet and you do a calculation that factors in the risks that you were talking about, and you look at what the natural advantages that Canada have are. There is no universe that I can see that doesn't involve expansion in the oil sands sector in Alberta, not based on Canadian energy needs, based on global energy needs. That doesn't mean that we have to continue to build that sector the way that we have up until this point. I am pushing oil and gas companies, provincial government, federal government, to see higher renewable content go into the extraction of that resource. And there's another really important point, I think, that doesn't get shared as much that I think is important. Almost half of the value of a barrel of oil is not the energy value. It's the chemical value. It's the building blocks for plastics. It's the building blocks for other catalytic chemicals. It's the other things that are used that have nothing to do with burning fossil fuels. In fact, the use of those chemicals actually contributes to reducing GHGs in other sectors. It is imperative that we develop our resources responsibly and then take action to offset the carbon that we release in so doing. Use more ethanol.
I'll take that one from. I'll answer that one from a perspective that I haven't focused on enough yet today. But it's one about equity, and the challenge we face is that we're going to be asking a whole series of billions of people in emerging economies to develop in a way that is different from us. In other words, we're asking them to do it differently and to absorb more of those costs. We pulled energy out of their markets, and now they're obviously looking to do the same here. It's very difficult to say that you're going to see anything change from the business as usual sort of course on the oil sands. But on the technical side, I couldn't agree more with Scott. There are ways that we can reduce that footprint. We do as much as we can to try and take advantage of those. And those guys are fully aware of it. One of the major reasons, one of the big reckonings in that sector this year is that most of them, especially TransCanada, thought that Keystone Pipe was going to go down. They weren't out in front of that explaining just what they are doing to try and reduce their footprint. It would have gone a long way to curbing some of that anti-pipeline efforts in the U.S. So,
though I do find it interesting that the greatest advocate for the pipeline is the senator from Texas, Ted Cruz, who was born in Calgary. So it's an interesting dichotomy in the U.S. as to what's going on with the politics.
Well,
on that
especially
one.
where you have a lot of jobs at the processing end of the pipeline as well. But
It's-
Barbara, do you have any final comments that you would like to add?
I don't have much on the oil sands, only to say I would never demonize a particular source of fuel. I think it's just as you say, you look at the footprint, you legislate, regulate to the levels you want, and you let industry achieve that. But I think that's part of the battle. It's become a boogeyman, and no one will go near it in a sense. Well, it's still turning away, but in certain communities,
I
it's
go
just
back to
evil.
compared to what?
Yeah.
Like Venezuelan oil is horrifically dirty and very heavy in metals like molybdenum and vanadium, and those are nasty, nasty things based on your exposure. So you got to pick your environmental problem.
Wow, this is good, starting to heat up, which I enjoy, but again, I see that our organizers are starting to reach that cane with the hook in my direction, so I want to encourage you to think that, yes, we've had a good hour, but this hour is only the starting point. Come up and ask your question individually. We shouldn't draw this to an end just quite yet, but I see that my friends have a few final words for us.
So if you guys just want to give a round of applause to our amazing panelists who are coming out today. As well as to Paul. It's been great help. You did an amazing job. We also wanted to give a big thanks to Tracy and Iris for their help for today. Without them, this event would not be as successful as it was. And if you have any questions about Climate Action Project, and our plans for the coming terms, feel free to talk to Mavis and I at any point afterwards. We'll be here for a while. But again, thank you so much for everyone coming out today.